Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I want to thank the Academy for this invitation to this very important conference with a lineup of such excellent speakers and very important topics that really warrant a good and very earnest discussion, which I'm sure we've already started today and we're going to have more in the next 3 days. It's always a privilege and a challenge to have the last word of the day. So here goes. I'm going to talk a little bit about, because I was asked about the title of this book I edited 5 years ago and where we stand now from there, called NATO in Search of a Vision. Hence, there's a title of a book that I edited with a question mark, which made me worried, like, did it really mean something back then? But just to start off, I want to bring a little anecdote of my own. I mean, the challenges that we're facing now are happening so rapidly, and I think, you know, much more than they were in the 1990s. I couldn't help but be reminded of my own experience at that point when I was listening to Ambassador Ada about Russia not even having a name at some point. I remember my own little anecdote in 1991 when I was still a little research assistant at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and the Secretary General had decided for the first time to invite Warsaw Pact countries to a summit of the North Atlantic Assembly. And I remember one former Warsaw, well, back then it was a Warsaw Pact member state, coming up to me and saying, "Excuse me, can you please help me? I don't have a nameplate." So I had to rush into the stationery cupboard and cut out a cardboard makeshift nameplate for that country. And he was so pleased that he had a nameplate when I gave it to him. And so I think that was my contribution to the end of the Cold War, no matter how it was. And now, of course, that country is a member of NATO, so time does fly by. But I mean, looking back, I think, that period, although very exciting and very rapid, what we're facing now is, I think, much, much more dangerous. And in that sense, I share Ambassador Ada's concerns with regards to what's happening now. So just to talk a little bit about the book. What we wanted to do here was basically do a stock taking of NATO's 60 years. Rebecca Moore and I edited this volume. We brought in prominent academics and policymakers from both sides of the Atlantic, first of all to address the stock taking, but also to look at what the challenges for NATO might be within the next decade before the next strategic concept. The book was used by the group of experts chaired by Madeleine Albright at the time, as they were leading up to the report that led to the strategic concept. And in fact, some of the authors of ours were members of that group. Now, 5 years on, we're faced with so many different challenges that we could not even foresee 5 years ago. And I don't think we need to even wait a decade to rethink where we should be before the next strategic concept. Some of the issues we highlighted in the book are nevertheless still on the table, but in a different way. We address the comprehensive approach to complex operations. That's obviously still relevant. NATO-Russia relations, of course, we had no idea how we were going to go down the road back then. One of the issues that we dwelled on, of course, was missile defense with relation to NATO-Russia relations. Another interesting chapter by Jeffrey Simon was the demographic factors in the alliance and how these would impact the future of transatlantic relations. And I think that is still a very important long-term challenge that we need to think about, changing demographics on both sides of the Atlantic and how that might cause a transatlantic rift 20 years from now. Partnerships, I think, that we really emphasized are still very important in terms of both regional engagement but also NATO's global role. And missile defense, of course, that's becoming less of a highlighted issue at the moment given what we're dealing with. But what we couldn't, or anyone else couldn't foresee, is future tensions among allies. And I think that's more real now than it was 5 years ago. And I think this is going to be the most crucial challenge we must face for the next 5 years before the next strategic concept. Before going on to how we got here, it's a very dismal picture, I'd like to give a brief background as to NATO's missions and therefore vision, how these evolved and where we're going now. So the way I would frame it is that NATO has got these three phases in its evolution. And the first phase was really, it was against obviously the Soviet threat in the sense it was a military alliance, but it was a much more normative role and part and parcel of a grand design or a big project, which was basically the post-1945 liberal world order. In this sense, NATO was one aspect of a wider Western grand strategy, albeit a central one. And the grand strategy formulated at the end of the Second World War rested on three things. First of all, the establishment and maintenance of a world order based on Wilsonian principles, peace, stability, democratic governance, and free market economies. So the essence of the transatlantic relationship was really to preserve a certain way of life. And I think, you know, what happened in the second phase was going beyond that preservation and promoting that way of life. And now the third phase where, as the ambassador said, we really need to rethink how much of our values do we take for granted. So I think, you know, again, when you look at the normative role of NATO, you can see that through all the three phases. The second phase was really when NATO moved into more of a collective security provider role. It was an absorber, if you like, of the post-communist space. It was a radiator of stability here. And it wasn't just fighting off enemies anymore. It was fighting off bad examples, as the German diplomat Dieter Manke put in an ISS study back in '92, that, you know, things like Yugoslavia, for example, breaking up and NATO's later intervention in both Bosnia and Kosovo weren't just about direct threats to NATO member states. They were putting right things that could challenge the very norms that NATO rested on. It was fighting these bad examples, if you like, that was also promoting a way of life, not just preserving it, but promoting it. And this was also a time when, you know, collective security took some sort of precedence over collective defense or in-area collective defense. It was still, of course, the core function of NATO, but NATO was now, like I said, putting things right through humanitarian purposes and military intervention and holding up norms. According to Paul Kennedy, it was the success of the first phase which laid the foundation for its continuation in the second phase. Writing in '91, he said that if Truman, Marshall, and Acheson and their advisors had been asked what sort of a world order they hoped would be in place in 40 years later, the broad outlines might look very close to what exists today. So it was a very euphoric moment, and I think that is one of the drawbacks of this very murky third phase that NATO's entered now, or fourth phase after borderless collective defense, because the euphoria or that self-confidence of our own rhetoric, as was mentioned in the previous panel, was, I think, one of the drawbacks that have led us today. It was the success of the 1990s that made us a little too relaxed in our own narrative of what was going on. And the fact that we're still using the same templates to make sense of a world that is totally different. The third phase, I would say, was borderless collective defense with Afghanistan. This was when we really saw out of area as a new concept. NATO was no longer just fighting off bad examples and for the greater good. It was actually fighting enemies that were now not so clear-cut or military powerful as the Soviet Union was, like a bit like the Phantom Menace, if you like. But it was still Article 5. It was still collective defense. But now collective defense was no longer just confined to in area. You had to go anywhere in the world and project some military prowess for the security of your own members. So this was a new concept. And so after 2001, projecting stability was not only for the greater good, but for the defense of the alliance. And then that brings us to this very murky episode. First of all, we have this three turning points, really, I think, that got us where we are today. First of all, the intervention in Libya and basically the responsibility, the R2P R2P concept that has been badly eroded, and the bad footprint that NATO has, I think, very unjustly accrued from all of these episodes as a security provider. And then the blur between collective defense and collective security, the fact that you need a comprehensive approach for both. And then finally, the rule of law, challenges to legitimacy and intervention, and the ownership of norms in the international system. Now, when we look at Libya and R2P and this bad footprint, what do I mean by all that? Well, in Bosnia, both I4 and S4 brought stability and created a secure environment. Same with the preventive deployment in Macedonia and K4. So this created a template that really shaped people's expectations. When things go wrong, NATO intervenes. Usually there's air power, boots on the ground, peace enforcement, UN Security Council mandate, well, not in Kosovo, good track record as a security provider in an environment of post-conflict reconstruction. Now, of course, ISAF was not I4 or K4. It did have elements of a post-conflict reconstruction mission, but it also had a combat role, and it didn't create a secure environment. And I think this was the first question mark. Wait a minute, we thought that NATO could actually do this. But of course, by the time NATO had gone into Afghanistan, into Bosnia and into Kosovo, there was no conflict, whereas in Afghanistan the conflict was still going on. So this was again a new challenge that NATO had to deal with. But I think Libya of all, it really sort of laid the ground for where we go from here, because although it was if you look at it in terms of what the intervention was, it was successful. If you look at it in terms of the legality, it was watertight. There was a UN Security Council resolution. It was a humanitarian mission. It was responsible to protect. It just looked so good on paper. But when after the intervention and the consequences of that has really been very bad for NATO, almost as if it had been so much better if they hadn't intervened at all. Because in the aftermath, there has been no security provision for a start. Libya has really been the turning point that has blocked any further humanitarian intervention linked to Chapter 7 in the UN Charter, because for Russia and China, this era of inconsistent objection to Western-led military humanitarian operations is over after Libya. Russia particularly made this very clear, that this was an absolute red line, that they would never ever again support a Western-led operation that led to regime change under the pretext of humanitarian intervention. Whereas, even though they were very much against the Kosovo intervention, in fact, they blocked the Security Council resolution, after the intervention, Russia became part of KFOR. So at the end of the day, you always had a Russia that you could work with, even in the aftermath of an operation. With Bosnia, they were very much supportive of in the loop. But after Libya, there was a very clear line that, from now on, the UN Security Council will not function in this way. No more humanitarian intervention through Chapter 7 with legality. And I think, this is precisely what we see in Syria today, with all the resolutions that have happened, that have come before the Security Council have been blocked because of this reason. And so there's been this uneasiness, if you like, after Libya about future interventions or any further intervention, hence this stalling over Syria for the international community. And the link between successful military intervention and the legitimacy in rebuilding states is officially over after Libya. And I think this is what has left a very bad footprint as a security provider for NATO. And of course, it's not NATO's fault, because they can't do everything. And also, NATO always maintained that they weren't asked to do any post-conflict reconstruction in Libya. They weren't even asked to do any DDR, which was actually talked about for some time. But nevertheless, the expectation is there that NATO does do security provision after military intervention, and that expectation has been broken. And I think this is a very significant thing. The second thing is, there's this whole blur between collective defense and collective security. And you do need a comprehensive approach, which is still on the table, for both. And I'd be very interested to know how this is going to be tackled, not just in the upcoming summit and more so, but also in the writing of the new strategic concept. And 5 years isn't a very long time. It just springs on you very quickly. So I'm sure that, you know, people in NATO strategic planning are already thinking about it. But this is the problem. You start thinking about something as big as a strategic concept that's going to determine your outlook for the next decade. And the world is changing so rapidly that whatever you thought about even 5 years ago suddenly becomes irrelevant. And so when we looked at the strategic concept and the group of experts report back in 2010, there was this very artificial distinction between active engagement, modern defense, assured security, dynamic engagement. And a lot of these keywords were really to address the security priorities of one set of allies who really wanted to see in-area collective defense and against Russia, and a group of other allies who wanted to see a more expanded role in crisis management and a more global role for NATO. And the fact is that you could balance both was for the next 10 years was the message. This was only, well, 5 years ago, but misleading today. And collective defense and collective security and rule of law are becoming increasingly blurred and may not necessarily have to be borderless. This was one of the military exercises that was held at the NATO Rapid Deployment Corps in Istanbul last year. I was doing a keynote there, and one of the things about the exercise was, what if we didn't have to do borderless collective defense that we'd been thinking about since Afghanistan? What if we had to do in-area defense like we did during the Cold War, which had become more and more of a reality after the annexation of Crimea and Ukraine, obviously. So this was actually, reflected in NATO exercises as well. And securing the borders of a NATO member state at the time, we were thinking, would have to involve further considerations such as rule of law, good governance, consideration for minorities, and establishing legitimacy. Because it's this struggle between Russia and the Western world, if you like, not just for influence and power, but who controls the norms, who has ownership of these norms. And I think, this is really reflected also in how you secure NATO's borders. Because you know how the whole Ukraine intervention is dressed from the Russian perspective. So you have to, as NATO, not just prepare for military defense, but also look at all these normative challenges which are coming at you from all kinds of directions. So not only will collective defense not necessarily be borderless, but it will also have to take into account the comprehensive approach, a wide spectrum of civil and military instruments, and close cooperation and coordination among a variety of actors. Now, that looks really beautiful on paper, but when I think about what we need to do and all the challenges out there on the field, if we can't even agree among allies, how are we going to manage that? And I think that is a serious problem. With regards to the rule of law, like I said, this is a lot about ownership. It's the war of norms, really. Well, there's Article 5, obviously, that stands. There's Article 51 of the UN Charter for Self-Defense. The humanitarian link to Chapter 742 is really becoming less and less relevant as Russia is blocking everything in the Security Council with regards to this. Then we have the precedence of humanitarian intervention without Chapter 7, Kosovo, and the way Russia addressed the whole Georgia intervention. They didn't say, well, I intervened in Georgia because, you know what, I can. They actually said, I'm here because of humanitarian law. And, so it's also, we also have to look at how the language is being used, how legitimacy is being twisted, how norms are being used in different contexts. Responsibility to protect. I'm afraid NATO's consistency and footprint as a security provider is now seriously eroded in that respect. The responsibility while protecting concept that Brazil put forward is not widely recognized, and it's very, very murky, if you like, to understand. Secession, while unspeakable at the end of the Cold War, is now possible to talk after Kosovo. Dissolution as successor states was the way to go in terms of redrawing borders, but now obviously secession is on the table, and we looked at what happened de facto with Crimea. And self-determination, of course, the way Russia is, again, dressing Crimea and the intervention there in that respect. So the mandates, apart from Article 5, are really not clear. They're not straightforward. When we say we need to rethink our values and not take them for granted, we really need to go back and examine all of these rules of law in the international system and try to reevaluate what they mean today, not what they meant 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And I think this is very important when also planning for military operations as well. Otherwise, you're in a danger of losing legitimacy. So we get to the point where we are in this power norms nexus in the sustainability of Western power in the international system, or the post-1945 order. And I think this challenge is really more acute today than it's ever been before. This was, as I said, reinforced in the 90s with the euphoric, exceptional period of collective security and responsibility to protect, absorbing the post-communist space. It was a lovely time, but it's over. And the systemic shifts in the global balance of power are not just about power, but also the ownership of norms. And regional reflections of these global shifts we're seeing in the Middle East is the end of the post-Ottoman Sykes-Picot nation-state order. So we're actually now facing the second big challenge since the 90s of redrawing new borders. And the 90s were relatively easy. We had a set of rules that everybody agreed with. Today we don't, and I think that's the main challenge, as to how we move forward with this. How do you keep things intact? And to finish off, I think, you know, the real challenge is different priorities between allies, different threat perceptions. And the different threat perceptions, you know, we had different priorities, obviously, back at the time of the old strategic concept, when it came to viewing Russia as a threat. After Ukraine and Crimea, I think NATO is more or less closer in terms of the Russian threat. But now there are different priorities between the allies. The United States is still focused on the Asia-Pacific as a strategic priority, much less for Europe. I work a lot with the Allied Command Transformation, and I work a lot at the SMPC every year. And the Americans there, they were very much asking me to emphasize the Asia-Pacific dimension. You try to explain that to a group of partners from the Middle East, and they're like, well, I'm sorry, Syria, what's the Asia-Pacific? So, but you really, I mean, forget about partners. It's also with allies. Turkey and the US have a very serious, different way of looking at things over Syria. Turkey has a 900-kilometer border with Syria. It's a NATO border, a border that's violated by Russian jets every now and then, a border where Turkey and US have very different security priorities. Whenever I'm asked about this in the international and national Turkish media, I always say, well, this is not really a NATO matter. It's a bilateral matter between Turkey and the United States, and they'll work it out. But deep down inside, I know, of course it affects NATO. If Turkey and the US disagree over something as huge as this, in other words, the US supporting a group on the ground in Syria that Turkey considers a terrorist force, that is directly challenging its national sovereignty, then you have a problem. And Vice President Biden's visit not too long ago was actually quite disastrous in that respect, I thought, because although they both put a brave face about how much they were on the same page about everything, they seriously disagreed about this issue. And when I was talking to, on a television show with a former US ambassador to Ankara, he just said, look, we didn't even know about this group, these Syrian Kurds, about a year ago. We just turned to them out of desperation because there's no one else on the ground to help us. And, you know, when you have comments like that as well to allies, it's like, we haven't really thought about this very carefully, but this is how we're going to do it, and you just have to come on board. It just doesn't go down very well. And I think, you know, we really need to think about these very, very carefully. And finally, this is, again, I mean, when we were talking about the book 5 years ago, we couldn't foresee two NATO allies disagreeing over Syria or repercussions of Russia active in Syria. There was no Syrian war back then. Turkey and the Assad regime were on very good terms. It seemed like a galaxy far, far away. And so how do you prepare for the future when the world is changing so rapidly? I know that we're going to talk a lot about ISIL or Daesh here as well. I'll finish off with some thoughts on that. I mean, it really is a global problem, not a regional one. And we need more intensified cooperation, both military and political, especially with countries in the region that are right next to it, like Turkey. The cells that it operates under are virtual. They take the idea like a franchise. And so after an attack like Paris or Istanbul, it's very difficult to find the trail leading somewhere else. There is no integrated command structure emanating from Raqqa or elsewhere. Yet these virtual cells do tap into very real global networks. We're living in a much more interconnected world than before. What we have to work with naturally becomes smaller too. For example, improvised explosive devices targeted at NATO allies and partners in Afghanistan are the output of networks that span over 50 countries. And again, on that note, I really think we should emphasize two things looking forward in this very dismal time of rapid change. Try to see security concerns of our allies on the same page. Try to understand their own security concerns, especially regional ones. And work with allies and partners in the region, in various regions. Try to prioritize our security and defense. But in terms of tapping into these global networks that support terror, we really need to have much more intensified cooperation that goes beyond military means. And on that note, I'll end here. Thank you very much.